Okay, hello everyone, and welcome to Curious Confusion. Now, before we get started with today's juicy tidbit, I'm going to ask you for a small favor, and if you have not subscribed, please click the subscribe button next to the description. It'll help me a great deal. And for those of you who have already subscribed, thank you so much, and you guys are wonderful. Okay. Today we're going to go over an article entitled "Former British Royal Family Butler Says Rice should be eaten with a fork and knife, not hands, and rice eating netizens school him." So we've got a very, very irresistible piece of news, or rather a very irresponsible, irresistible snippet that I could not help sharing with you guys. Okay, let's get into the article. We'll read it really quickly and then I will get into my take on it. Okay, just because something isn't done that way in your culture or social circle, it does not mean that any other way is wrong. Okay, what are we going on about? It's about this extremely insensitive katak di bawah tempurung named Grant Harold, a self-proclaimed etiquette expert from Britain, who was also the former butler to Prince Charles, William, and Harry. For those of you who are not Malaysian, a katak di bawah tempurung is the Malay term for an ignoramus. It literally translates to a frog living under a shell, which means someone who is not cognizant about the different things in the world, just like a frog under the shell. Okay, on March 6th, Grant decided to give out some advice on how to eat rice via his Twitter account, which resulted in so much rage. No need for cutlery. Ladies and gentlemen, okay, this is what the guy said, yeah. Ladies and gentlemen, remember we always use a knife and fork or chopsticks to eat rice. We do not use our hands or fingers, he tweeted, accompanied with this disgusted looking emoji. Okay, and this is the actual tweet, yeah, with a picture of somebody using cutlery to eat rice. Okay, so ladies and gentlemen, remember we always use a knife and fork or chopsticks to eat rice. We do not use our hands or fingers. Okay, as you would expect, many people online were far from pleased. They were not pleased with him. Okay, Shweta says, it's gross on so many counts. You should clean your hands more often than your steels and woods. Mocking someone's traditions and culture is called racism. If you use a fork and spoon on our banana leaf plates, you will practically be eating from your table. Good point, yeah. So in South India, they have a tradition of eating banana leaf on a banana leaf plate, which means that if you use a fork and a knife or fork and spoon and you try doing that, what's going to happen is it might rip the banana leaf and send your curry spilling all over the table, and that's not what you want, right? Okay, now some other people were also not very pleased, and it seems that Defender of India says, we will never behave like pompous morons who have no clue that the world has more than one rule of etiquette. Okay, as you can see, he's offended quite a number of people. Okay. It wasn't a lot of people were not very happy. Ooh, what's this? Queen Elizabeth eating rice with her hands. Yeah, that's a good point. Yeah, I guess he's also calling Queen Elizabeth a bumpkin if there's a picture of her eating with her hands. Blah, 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 stick to your mashed potatoes. Okay, and the list goes on. What's my take on it? Well, okay, I mean, it's very tempting to call this guy a racist, somebody who's trying to dog whistle towards people from, cultures which are not British and not East Asian. Because, see, for a very, very long time, the racist colonialists considered East Asians, like Chinese, Japanese, and Koreans, to be the so-called model minority, which is basically code word for honorary Aryan. And in fact, you go back in time to the time of Sir Stamford Raffles, the governor of Singapore, and he was saying stuff like, well, the Malays, there's no hope for them, but the Chinese, on the other hand, oh, they could be our potential allies. And you even have racists like Dylan Roof, for example, going on about the fact that Asians, by which he doesn't mean Asians like Indians, Pakistanis, or Bangladeshis. He means Asians like Chinese, Koreans, or Japanese. Asians have quite a lot in common with us, so they could potentially be our allies. And I think East Asians, we are put in a very, very awkward position in the West because, see, we are not quite considered to be equal to whites in racist circles, yet racist circles consider us to be far more tolerable than brown Indians, such as Indians, Nepali, brown Asians, such as Indians, Nepalese, Pakistanis, Bangladeshis, Malays, Thais, what have you. So I think East Asians, whenever people call us the model minority, and other minority groups in the West hate us because of this divide and conquer tactic, we are in a very, very awkward position. Now, some of us will try to prove that, we're on the same boat as other minorities. We're not, we want to show that we're in solidarity with other minorities. And then there are Asians who also join up with the alt-right, but I digress. Yeah, but let's give Mr. Harold, or was it Mr. Grant? I don't even remember whether his surname was Harold or Grant. Okay, let's give him the benefit of the doubt and assume that this was done with good intentions, although the road to hell is paved with good intentions after all. Let's assume that he was saying this out of purely good, noble intentions, and he actually meant well by it. He's just trying to give people some innocent advice on etiquette. I understand that in the West, it is customary to use utensils when you consume rice, right? So it is considered bad form to use your fingers, for example, to eat anything besides finger food or hamburgers or hot dogs. I understand that, so that I can acknowledge. But what I find particularly glaring about this is that there doesn't seem to be any context from which this gentleman has derived this statement. Now, for instance, let's just say, for the sake of argument, that an Indian person or a Pakistani person had entered a high-class Michelin star restaurant, like he entered Gordon Ramsay's restaurant, or he'd entered a fancy French restaurant and used his hands, then it would make sense that, he would say, ladies and gentlemen, remember, we always use a knife and fork, chopsticks to eat rice. We don't use our hands or fingers. That does make sense if there's that context, because then he's giving well-meaning advice to people who might not be aware of the cultural differences between Europeans and South Asians, right? But because there's no context, that he just said this out of the blue, it's understandable that many people from these cultures, these cultures in which people use their hands to eat rice, would get defensive. It's understandable. It's perfectly understandable. It's although that may not have been his intention to offend people, nevertheless, it's really, I think it's very culturally insensitive to basically deride someone's culture without any specific context, out of the blue. Like I could say, for example, there are aspects of other cultures that I find distasteful, right? But I don't just bring them out without any context, you see, because that would cause bad relations between me and a person from that other culture. Let me give you an example. Now, when I went to Australia to study, for example, I studied in Adelaide, which is in southern Australia. I had this course mate from Hong Kong, and we were exchanging some private words between us, having drinks after uni, and he was saying that why is it that people in the Western countries throw their children out at 21, or 20 years old, they're expected to fend for themselves. It's just so cruel, right? Okay, whether or not you think it's cruel, in Asia, it's not customary for us to leave our parents' houses until we get married, right? And that's a cultural difference between East and West. But we don't say, for example, like Asians, Asians, whether we live in the West or not, we don't go on social media saying things like, hey, why do parents these days go kick their kids out, in non-Western countries? Why do they do that? What a backward tradition. We don't do stuff like that because that would cause a rift between us and our Western friends, right? Although they may have a certain cultural practice which is different from ours. We don't do that because we don't want to make enemies now, do we? Another thing which I want to point out was the fact that some people would just say that he is ignorant, he's not aware of Indian culture. So as the people in this article said, he is a katak di bawah tempurung, which means a frog under a shell. But I don't think that's really the case, because the British were in India for nearly 200 years, if I'm not mistaken. So obviously he's quite aware of the fact, he's acutely aware of the fact that Indian people, culturally at least, not all, but culturally do eat rice with their hands. So it's not that he's culturally ignorant. But what I think has happened in this case is that he very patronizingly assumes, this is just my take on it, I don't think he's racist, but he's still living with a rather colonial mentality. He very patronizingly assumes that, Indian guests or Pakistani guests who go to high-class Western functions will not have the good sense to eat rice with utensils. And so he's basically trying to give advice without bringing up race, but he's basically giving advice to Indian people or Middle Eastern people or, Pakistani people or Nepalese people or other South Asian people. He's basically trying to give some advice to them, which can come across as very patronizing, because he seems be laboring under the delusion that these people are not aware of the rules of Western civilization. He still thinks that they are still living in darkness. But to my recollection, there hasn't been a single case, of any Indian person entering a high-class European restaurant and trying to eat rice with their hands. There's just hasn't been any case of that happening. And all Indian people who actually travel to the West, or Middle Easterners who travel to the West, they know that if they enter a high-class European venue, they know that they're not supposed to eat with their hands. So I think this was rather a redundant point to make, really, and it put him in a lot of hot soup, because people felt that he was race baiting. He was basically indirectly targeting the people whose cultures involve them eating with their hands without mentioning them directly. But I think it was just a piece of patronizing, well-meaning advice. That's just my take on it. Okay, guys, guess that's all I have to say. And I'd like to hear your opinion on this matter. Like, was it just an innocent piece of advice, misinterpreted? Was this man's intentions rather misinterpreted, or was it racist dog whistling, against, primitive, backward Southeast Asian people? You see the inverted commas here, so I don't mean it literally. Okay, yeah, it's up to you to decide. And till next time, take care.